Lacan. That's a solution. I made like 4 pages of this already. I'm gonna use CapCut to show it. I already said this, but I had to take a take 2 already. But damn it, the light! I can barely see here. But for the dialect on individual, the base thing is Lacan. I took a lot of inspiration from Lacan, although, there's stuff that I didn't, but for Lacan, like the reality, whatever, real thing, I don't like that idea. I interpreted it differently, how trauma affects people. It's more on the dialect between culture, mind, and self, which I'm going to be saying a lot here, but just know culture, mind, and self specifically would be symbolic, real, and imaginary. Culture is symbolic, mind is real, and self is imaginary. It's a dialectical system. First I have to get rid of the words that I actually wrote here. Desire is it's insecurity. It's insecurity as a drive for want. Lack, which is another word, is insecurity itself, not without any extra stuff. Lack creates desire because desire is lack. I wrote a diagram on how the self works, which is going to be important for understanding imaginary. Well, no, actually, it's not how the self works. I know I put self there, but replace self for mind, because this is how the mind works, not the self. I wrote self for convenience sake. Insecurity / lack creates want / desire, despite being want / desire, which the fulfillment of desire, the fulfillment of the lack of something creates happiness, temporary happiness, which isn't real because true happiness is defined as the lack of insecurity, which I will get into. But also, as seen from people who are just happy on random days, something sees think, it can also be a temporary lack of lack, like a negation of the negation of lack. It's just, you have nothing. And because you don't have any issues temporarily, because you don't feel for any greater thing, it's like a temporary idea of nihilism, and that creates a temporary happiness. Usually this doesn't happen because majority of people have suffering. While suffering is life-affirming as it creates more desires because it creates more insecurity, and it often recreates the person, so they get more insecurities and wants, which leads to more happiness and leads to more life. It also stops the lack of lack. Yeah, it's a different way to achieve happiness. Instead, you need to often get things. People who actually suffer are way less likely to just wake up happy. But people who do just wake up happy tend to suffer less. They can still suffer. None of these are real happiness, though. Culture creates the delusion self based in mind, and collective self holds culture as fact. The mind is a slate, basically, like those old ideas of humanity being a slate of nothing that's easily influenced. It's kind of like that with the mind. It's a determined machine like Hobbes that created the drive of insecurity. Hobbes does understand to a degree people, but he just understands it in a purely evil way. He doesn't understand that both good and evil are not real things and both are natural in its own right. It's insecurity, that's all it really is. Some words with this stuff is, I have to explain symbolic, real, and imaginary as itself, which I to a degree did. First is symbolic order, because symbolic has 2 sections, which are both the same thing in a degree. There's the symbolic order, or like hidden cultural norms. Like if you have a conversation, or if you just exist in general, you understand that there's things in life that you need to understand in order to get by. People with autism tend, I can say this because I'm pretty sure I was diagnosed with it, but tend to kind of not understand this section, the symbolic order. They have it crippled to a degree. and they don't understand cultural norms that are like outside of their perspective. This, I don't want to say anything about that, but it's important to note that cultural norms are basically the things that you learn in a society, and it's the hidden rules of the world. This creates the big other. Caesar talks about this a lot, of the big other, but the big other is basically rationality. I talked about rationality in my last video. Rationality enforces the symbolic order, and symbolic order creates rationality. They're technically the same thing in the end. I wrote something here. The big other is made by and creates the symbolic order. It is its internalization, therefore it's two forms of one order. I said it twice. Insecurity is the cause of it all, because insecurity is the basic drive of self. This is a predisposited idea that creates most of this. I put this in the wrong order, but if I move this here, I can move on to the second one. I wrote here triangle on symbolic, which will be in reference, culture. Imaginary being the self, and real being the mind. In pure honesty, I forgot where I was at, but the real is, the real is the self at its core. I wrote this down in the definition here. The real is at its core empty. It's the self in its empty core form. It's really, it's a mind. So you know how people differentiate the self and the mind in its different forms, as the mind is the core of the self. It's like the basic chemical thing. When I say the mind, I don't necessarily mean your brain as the mind. I mean the idea of all the chemicals and the nervous system and everything in your body working together to create the template for the delusion of self. It's a template of self. This is what I call the mind, even though it's literally not the mind. It creates insecurity at its drive, because I'll explain that later. Culture being the symbolic, it makes sense. It's both internalized culture and external culture. They're both basically the same thing. The imaginary in this example would be the self, a delusion of ego made by your body and mind, which I don't know why I wrote that, considering it's mind. You are not your mind, however, which majority of philosophers can agree on. You are not your mind, because your mind is still the template of self. It is not self itself. That's why people differentiate between the two. Here I inverted, in a way, the Lacan triangle of S, R, and I to culture, mind, and self in a dialectal upside-down triangle. You have culture on the top left, mind on the top right, and self on the bottom of both. It's a synthesis of both culture and mind. The culture creates the basic values of the self. Right this here. Self is also culturally induced as much as it is chemically. The feral self is not the self, but an evolutionary cultural self, just like the civilized self. The real is the self, nothing but a negation, a synthesis. The culture creates the influence, the mind creates the basis for what comes to be the delusion of self. Once again, dialects are needed to create delusions for a reason I'll get to later. I put a thing here on Lacan on how desire is all conscious, repressed or not. The pedophile knows his desire legal or not, able to do it or not, although a majority of them tend to repress it into paraphobia, insecurity, POCD, or more. It's clear proof that desire is not unconscious. If you can't do something, it doesn't become unconscious desire. It doesn't become insecurity. Well, it can become insecurity, but not unconscious insecurity. You know that it's desired, but either you turn that into hatred, repress it in a way where it's still conscious, because repression is still conscious to a degree. But it's not unconscious desire. It always is. And I use pedophilia for example there, because it's the closest thing I could think of. And there's no real self. I wrote also here on repression. Repression is the turning of insecurity want into pure insecurity. which we do to stop feeling that want and that insecurity as well. Repression basically, it creates a pure form of insecurity in a way, but usually why you don't have it as pure insecurity, why when you repress something it doesn't turn into pure insecurity, which I'll get to later on narcissist, is because you don't repress the insecurity itself, you repress the idea and the cause of the insecurity, which creates the basic, repression thing. The culture, the mind, it creates the self and the dialect that's similar to Fitch's idea of dialect. I finish with that, I'll move on to the next paper. Dialectic is the process of diluting a nothing with a something by making a nothing against it. It's the idea of having two things that aren't real, but they're opposites to each other in order to give value to each other. They need their opposite to exist because that's how you delude someone in the idea. You delude them by giving them the idea that it has to exist because there's the opposite of it. I mean, think about it. Within the human mind, if they see a world full of white or something, hypothetically, they would just see it as nothing. They wouldn't see it as white. But if there's black, then they understand that the world is white. Or if there's white, they would understand that the world is black. And they would know that the opposite of that is white or black or whatever. It's delusion. I put here another thing on collective. The culture and mind together would be the collective, basically. It's how you interpret everything on, it's what creates the self, basically. It's the basic idea of the self, which evolves through the self to create new selves. I mean, when you repress yourself, you return to this collective mind stage and create a new you, which is what usually happens to trauma, which is all the way up here, and I'm not supposed to get to. The culture creates the form of self, and the mind creates the drive of self, because, well, that's what they do. Insecurity is desire in new form. That's why all things are selfish. All things are to make oneself feel better, because insecurity is the drive of all. Self creates culture collectively to oppose mind. The synthesis makes the new antithesis for its eternal thesis. This also goes with cultural dialect, because it's all connected and such. Cultural dialect, class dialect. CSEC already went through class dialect. If you want a good understanding of class dialect and how it affects self, go watch a CSEC video or something. But I'm focusing on culture and self. And that would be between how the self keeps creating new antithesis for itself in general. Before, this is like a basic understanding of evolution. Before, there was mind, and there was evolution, the first culture in existence, the culture of survival. That evolution creates self. It would be the feral self in most ideas. Now, this feral self stops existing when the evolution had its counterculture, the first counterculture, which is not like literal counterculture as we have it today, but culture. Culture is the first counterculture of evolution. This culture creates a new form of the self, which is called the civil self. This is mind and culture, which creates self. That self later collectively creates counterculture, and so far we haven't seen anyone born in counterculture, because counterculture, if it became a new stage of culture, would be post-culture, not counterculture. But for this example, I put counterculture down, because we have no way of articulating how post-culture would look, or if it would eventually lead to the end of culture. But for this example, we have counterculture instead, a new form of culture in a more progressive stance or something. And the mind mixes with counterculture to create the new self. This new self is the same self as the civil self, as the feral self. It's all the same thing in different times. There is no evolution of the self, only evolution of what causes the self. And that cause of the self is the culture, and it influences how the self acts. Culture is the counterculture to evolution, as counterculture is to culture. It's pretty seen here with evolution interacting with culture usually led to a more evolved form of evolution, mutual aid or societies or whatever. And then culture with counterculture creates a new form of culture, progressivism and all this stuff. And sometimes traditionalism too, it kind of backfires, but that also happens with like tribes and evolution and culture, social Darwinists. Sometimes the new synthesis of counterculture can be a return back to the old culture or something, because that happens. And I put etc. here because I cannot write more about that. I really think that Lanza, despite not knowing Lacan, was pretty Lacanian in the basic sense. Like, he was inspired by Unabomber's ideas of feral self and blah blah blah, but after, when he abandoned that, he kind of realized the thing on value. He basically misunderstands the role of value with the role of the imaginary self, which in a degree is true, because the imaginary self is what creates the disposit of value. Culture uses value. Culture creates value through the self. The self is what has value as its basis. You could say, well, I thought the mind was a basis. Well, no, this is a different form of basis. This is the basis of which they use to create insecurity into something else, into like a drive. Insecurity itself cannot be a drive until you have, value. Value is used as the drive for insecurity to become a drive, and that is what culture uses in order to teach and create the symbolic or big other orders. So both of those are connected to culture and internalization and discipline. This is a pretty simple concept, I think. That's why Lanza came to the idea that death stops desire and is ultimately true happiness, which I put over there later on, because value in the self will always persist and create new forms of insecurity and new drives and more issues with insecurity and such. And since true happiness is described as I put here, I'll just read right here so I don't have to read this later. If happiness, true happiness, is the lack of insecurity, it is death. Because insecurity is seen as suffering, mental suffering, as compared to real suffering. You need insecurity to live, and that's another thing, because it's still suffering in its base form, and suffering is life as the way it is life-affirming. Insecurity is a drive for people, and it's a drive for anything. You cannot do anything that isn't out of insecurity. That's why insecurity is the basis of everything. What makes insecurity is seeing your body and your mind as yourself, mistaking it for you. I write more about that here, which I'm going to read out because I'm done with this paper too. The insecurity made by the assumption by quote-unquote you being your body, mind, culture, gender, race, or even self or sex is what drives everything that makes you believe you exist. The dialectic is dialectal. What I mean by this, and I write this down, is that, like people put with the reality real thing, which I still disagree with, culture and mind, as compared to their idea of culture and self, or culture and self. Instead, I believe it's culture and mind that creates the outside effect, which is dialectal, to the inside effect, which is self. The dialect of what creates culture, what creates self, is in dialectic with the self itself, which creates the delusion of you. You are both the external and the internal assumptions of you because of this dialect of a dialect. To put it simpler, external and internal creates the delusion of you. This is the dialectic of identity. It's also a lie, because once again, you do not exist in all forms. It's just impossible. People like to describe Lacan as an anti-philosophy. I think truly it has to be the basis of philosophy in general. Here I wrote stuff about certain mental disorders and its effect with Lacan. Paranoia, psychosis, and histrionic behaviors is insecurity in its impure extreme forms. Mixing with mind and reality, it mixes with the external understanding through the self, through the internal extreme insecurity of the self, and that messes with the you delusion. Meanwhile, On the other hand, narcissism is pure insecurity. By repressing all insecurity, I mentioned this before, it's a different pure insecurity. This is not like pure insecurity and repression, it's pure insecurity. By repressing insecurity itself, all insecurities back into the mind. That creates a pure insecurity that is unconscious entirely. I know I said majority of desire is conscious, but this you can be conscious of as a narcissist, but in its behavior, it affects your behavior, so it affects your mind. Because you see, unconscious is seen as the mind, right? All desire is in the self, not the mind. Because insecurity comes from the mind and turns into the self, it influences the self. The self creates the desires out of the insecurity, and is conscious of this. Narcissism forces all insecurity back into the mind and creates the unconscious insecurity, which is something that majority of people lack. It creates unconscious insecurity, like people assume insecurity is like in the first place. Antisociality is repression of the mind into insecurity of survival. It represses the mind into itself, and that basically undevelops it. It makes it more immature to a degree, emotionally. I'm not saying they're literally immature. Emotionally immature because it's underdeveloped through this repression of itself into itself. It recreates the mind. Then here is more things on the dialectic of you and blah blah blah. Mind is nothing, it is a chemical mindless existence. I need to say that because when we say mind, we're still talking about the basic, it's the basic understanding of society. Damn, the fucking fan went on. But it's a basic understanding of society, not society, but self, as just a blank slate, the first self, the conscious in a way. It is nothing. It's just the foundation that things are coming out of, and that's what's with the insecurity. The mind is not you. Trauma splits and represses self back into a culture / mind temporarily. This is what I was saying with self and mind. People like to say that the real and the reality and trauma and all that. I disagree with this. I think that trauma splits the self from the culture and mind and forces it back into the culture and mind. It creates a new you using the old you as a foundation, because you're recreated with a different understanding of the world from this traumatic experience. The culture stays the same, but you have more doubt about it, more insecurity about it. And the mind, well, it has way more insecurity, traumatic incidents used. And with that, it creates a new you, a new self, which is based on the old you and the old self, but with this new adapted sort of mechanics. This is what creates mental disorders that are caused by trauma. Most mental disorders that are caused by trauma. I can't really say for all of them, but not all mental disorders are caused by trauma too. I wrote something about how Lancer misused the word rape, because seriously, that was a big issue. He misunderstands it as like the destruction of agency and like being influenced. That's more akin to grooming. Rape is like a horrible thing. It is a complete loss of agency to the point that you can't put the dread in words, because it is absolutely destructive in every form, and it's a very delicate issue, and we really shouldn't misuse that word like Lancer did, because it's a serious thing. Then I'm gonna move on from that. Like philosophy, probably do not try to be your true self. I know therapists love to say like, be your true self. Go look for your true self. Here's how to do this. There is no true self. Once again, that would only lead to more issues. It's like my whole thing with philosophy. Probably don't look further into this stuff. Instead of listening to this and taking this as fact, you should discard everything I'm saying right now and say, no, that's wrong. I'm gonna go live my life being an idiot, because that's the only real way to achieve even some sort of comfort. Don't be yourself. And plus, because you cannot stop acting like yourself even if you don't exist, because even if you know that you are acting and that you don't exist, you can't stop acting. Everything you do will be insecurity. It will be charged by insecurity. It will be charged by this idea of yourself. So physically, you cannot change it. There is no point in trying to change this. There's no point. you cannot not be yourself, even if you are fake. That's why it's better to just believe that you exist than to not. Putting this all together, I'm going to try to make something out of it alone. I'd say that this is the basic dialectal understanding of identity. It's a dialect in its dialect, and it's based upon the idea of culture and mind creating self, and self creating the idea of inside and outside self through the culture-mind synthesis being the outside, and the result of it, the self, being the inside, which creates the delusion of you, your false understanding of what you are, which is what creates insecurity. What creates insecurity is falsely attributing yourself as your outside and your inside at the same time. For both of those are false, but your inside is the main delusion. You misinterpret this and see both of those as you, the outside and the inside, and that's what creates the delusion of you. Your body, your mind in like the traditional sense, which is my understanding of self. It's the normal philosophical understanding of mind. Body and mind, those are both inside and outside, respectively, reversed. Outside body, inside mind, those are both delusions that people see as you. But in reality, neither of those are really you in general, because you don't exist. But also, if anything, neither of those are even real themselves. Mind and culture are fabrications, just like self is a fabrication of both mind and culture together. This is all basically a delusion in a delusion, and it's very dialectal, I think. It sounds like a pseudo intellectual. I got most of this from Lacan. I do recommend reading Lacan, Zizek. I think for majority of this I got Lacan, Zizek, Lanza, Fitch, and Hegel for the basic idea of all of this. And basic things that I got from, my own thinking via insecurity as a base of everything, stuff like that, and the drive and happiness thing. That's basically it. Although I should probably go for the symbolic, real, imaginary thing one last time. Imaginary creates a big effort for symbolic, and symbolic creates the order, the influence of self, and creates the imaginary. The imaginary hides the real, and the real lays the groundwork for the imaginary. The real interprets the symbolic, and the symbolic creates delusion for the real, which is what creates the imaginary. That's the basic dialectal between Lacan without my fancy own words about culture, mind, and self, and that's the basic idea. This is 27 minutes long, I guess. I'll just end here. I'll put pictures of each of the images. There's no back pages to the images. It's just that, because I was too lazy to just write on the back side. Yeah.